A player that won 3 straight Defensive Player of the Year awards, an 8-time All-NBA player, including 4 first teams, finished second in MVP voting in 2011, and is now playing in Taiwan. Dwight Howard has had one of the strangest careers in the history of the league. And by the way, he was left off the NBA's 75th anniversary team, but that's a conversation for another day. We have to begin where most NBA stories start, and that is the draft. The 2004 NBA draft is one of the worst ones in recent memory, especially if you exclude the topic of today's video, Dwight Howard. At the time, most people assumed that the Orlando Magic were going to select Emeka Okafor first overall. He was a proven college player, someone that had a really good career, a little bit older, but this was a different time in the NBA. We didn't care as much about older college prospects, and it was very common for those proven college players to go high in the draft. The Magic out of nowhere select this high school kid named Dwight Howard to be their future of the franchise with the first overall pick, and it was a surprising selection at the time, and in hindsight, obviously the correct selection. The only other player in this class you could argue was on Dwight's level is Andre Iguodala, and even then, this was still absolutely the correct selection with number 1 overall. Then Okafor went 2nd overall and was significantly worse, mostly because of injury issues. And to begin his career, Dwight Howard was good. Like, he was very skinny, he was very young, still had a lot of things to work on, but he played 82 games as a rookie. It was the youngest player in NBA history to that point to average a double-double for an entire regular season, and then continued to improve, mostly by adding muscle to his frame, something that the Magic knew he needed to do once he got there. And almost immediately after that, it becomes clear that they absolutely made the correct selection. Make no mistake about it, there's a lot of negative connotations around Dwight Howard now, things that we're going to talk about throughout this video, but he was an absolutely dominant force in the early parts of his career in Orlando. One of the best defensive players in the league, and as I mentioned in the intro, arguably the best defensive player in the league when he won 3 straight Defensive Player of the Years. First team All-NBA center 4 years. He made 8 All-NBA teams overall and made 8 consecutive All-Star teams. And early on in his career in Orlando was an incredible and an unbelievable player. And things really started to shift for him in 2007. To that point, the Magic were fine, but they weren't, contending for the playoffs all the time. 2007, the Magic bring in Stan Van Gundy, and that changed everything for Dwight Howard. It's one of my favorite eras really to look back on, because it created this kind of new style in the NBA to that point. Stan Van Gundy was ahead of his time in many ways with those Orlando teams, because you have Dwight in the middle, you have all these 3-point shooters, you have all these guys that can create around him, and it's a really fun team. Jameer Nelson, Hedo Turkoglu, young Trevor Ariza's there. Later on, they get Courtney Lee, JJ Redick's there, and when you look at 3-point shooting numbers from this time period in the NBA, typically teams are not shooting very many at all. This is one of the few teams of that era, them and like the New York Knicks of this era, that actually competed with some of the teams now in terms of 3-point shooting attempts. The Magic shot over 26 3-point attempts a game at their peak when they made the finals, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, and that's only a few attempts behind what would be the worst team in the league in that category this year, the Chicago Bulls, at around 28 a game. But for them to even remotely compete with a modern NBA team in terms of 3-point shooting volume shows you how ahead of the curve they were, and all that had to do not only with Stan Van Gundy, but Dwight Howard as well, because when you had such a dominant force in the middle, even though he was never a great post player, but with pick and rolls and with him diving to the rim, it created so many opportunities for other players. You've got Rashard Lewis out there as a stretch 4. It was one of the more interesting dynamics in the league, and I feel like under talked about dynamics in the league is how early the Magic really were on trends that came later in the league. And by the way, not only were they a fun team, but they started winning 50 games like it was nothing once Van Gundy got there, and then in the 2009 postseason went on an unbelievable run. They defeat Boston in the second round, who won 62 games. They beat Cleveland, who won 66 games in the conference finals, and then they go on to the finals and they lose in 5 games to the Lakers. And a lot of times people look back on that series and think that it wasn't particularly close. Games 1 and 5 were not particularly close, but that series in general was much more competitive than I feel like a lot of people look back on it as, because they lost in 5 games. But still, it was incredible for Dwight to be 23, one of the best players in the league, a borderline MVP caliber player, someone that finished second in MVP voting at a certain point in his career. You made the finals. You would assume that this is going to spell a ton of success moving forward for Orlando. Yeah, not quite. That was the peak of the Dwight Howard Orlando Magic experience, was that 2009 run to the finals. The following year, they did make it back to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2010, but lost to that Boston team that, of course, was very, very good in that time period. And then after that, the Magic never made it out of the first round with Dwight Howard on the roster ever again. And it needs to be emphasized how incredible that is, that you have a player of Dwight Howard's caliber that basically peaked at 23 years old, that was an MVP caliber player that made the finals pretty early on in his career, and they had a solid team around him, yet everything fell apart in a span of just a few seasons. And it translates well to the modern era of the league, because a lot of the reasons that it fell apart, you can compare to why things like this fall apart in the modern era of the league as well. So with the limited success of those Magic teams post 2009, Dwight starts to get frustrated with the team. Again, a theme that we see all the time right now in the modern NBA. He also started to have some weird back injury stuff. He was a guy that was incredibly durable in the beginning of his career, played 82 games in a lot of his first couple of seasons, and things started to fall apart for him a little bit physically, and he just didn't feel like they were putting enough around him in order to create a championship level team. There were also rumors that he had asked the organization to fire Stan Van Gundy, which led to some really awkward moments between him and Van Gundy. And then ultimately, again, a theme of the modern NBA, he requests a trade. In 2011, Dwight Howard was going to be a free agent just a year later in 2012, and he decides to request a trade to either the Brooklyn Nets, who were building something there. They had just moved to a new place. They just moved to a new arena. They were kind of an exciting team at the time, or the LA Lakers or the Dallas Mavericks. And if this was the modern NBA, he would have gotten shipped to one of those teams, and that would have been the end of it. But this was Dwight Howard. This was one of the strangest careers in the history of the league, so things got weird. Basically, he tells the team, you're not doing enough to allow me to compete. I want to leave. I would like to stay with Orlando, but you're not doing enough to build a championship caliber team. He then has a meeting with the team. They convince him to stay. He opts into his new contract on the day of the trade deadline. They were going to trade him. They were going to grant his trade request because they didn't want to lose him for nothing in the offseason. He changes his mind and opts into an extra year of his contract right when he's about to get his wish of getting traded away. And then in the following offseason, changes his mind once again and once again requests a trade. And then that 2012 offseason, again, initially he would have been a free agent, but then he opts into his deal to make himself a 2013 free agent. And at that point, the Magic are like, we're over this. We don't want to do this anymore. You're being indecisive. We're just done. So Dwight ends up going to the Lakers, and this is a fateful moment in NBA history because they create this super team in LA with Dwight, Kobe, of course. They bring in Steve Nash. Everybody thinks it's going to be an incredible team, and they meant basically nothing to that NBA season in terms of a competitive standpoint. Spends just 1 year in LA. Goes on this whole year and a half long saga of wanting to get out of Orlando, wanting to get traded to one of the teams being the Lakers, and it goes so incredibly poorly that after just a year, the Lakers are like, you know what? We don't even want to bring the guy back. There's all these weird dynamics where he's arguing with the coach. He says he's not getting the ball enough, says that Kobe's shooting too much. The team says he's not in good enough shape. They can't run the offense they want to run. And it's just a complete and utter disaster of a season. And he ends up signing for free agency contract the year after with Houston to join up with James Harden. And Houston Dwight Howard was actually pretty good. There's some advanced numbers there that say that maybe he wasn't that great. And on a personal level, a continued theme throughout Dwight's career is that he just didn't get along very well with certain guys, and that his demeanor just did not match what a lot of these guys would like to have around on their team. But he's fine in Houston. Ultimately, that sours. He signs with Atlanta in 2016 for a 3-year, $70 million contract. That ultimately goes pretty poorly. Gets traded away to Charlotte for a season. They buy him out. Then he goes to Washington. Then he goes to the Lakers and wins a bubble title, by the way, which again just adds to the craziness that is the career of Dwight Howard, that he jumps around all these different teams. In like a 7-year span, he goes from an MVP caliber player to basically a backup center, then finds himself in a perfect situation back on the Lakers, wins the bubble title in 2020, then bounces around to Philly, back to the Lakers, and now he's playing in Taiwan. And when you think about having a weird NBA career, Dwight Howard checks every box. He was a surprise selection at first overall at the time and ultimately becomes the correct selection. Incredibly talented, crazy high level ceiling, makes it to the finals maybe earlier than people would have thought, borderline MVP caliber guy. Then things get weird. He starts to get injured a little bit. He's incredibly indecisive in terms of whether he does or doesn't want to be in Orlando, has a trade request or two in there, jumps around to multiple teams, wins a title, somehow has this redemption story with the Lakers after basically annoying every professional team that he had played for to that point, and then ultimately now is just in Taiwan playing professional basketball. It is weird, doesn't even begin to describe the career of Dwight Howard. But where I land on this is the weirdness and the distractions and all the strange stories and the trade requests, all that stuff I think ultimately is going to detract from what was a pretty unbelievable career, and a player that if you play their career 100 times, it probably goes better than this 50 to 60 of those times out of 100. Like, the injury stuff gets a little bit weird. I think in the modern era of the league, we would have been much more careful with Dwight in terms of him playing all those games in the beginning of his career, especially as he added muscle to what was a very skinny frame when he got to the league. He would have been a perfect fit in the modern era of the league in terms of this rim rolling center. There was way too much focus on trying to make him some kind of post player that he just did not have the kind of touch or offensive skills to become. And I think in a different era, we could be talking about Dwight Howard as one of the best centers to ever play the game. He had the work ethic in the beginning of his career to add the muscle to his frame. Yes, there are other things he could have worked on throughout his career. Maybe his mindset wasn't always there, but a lot of the negative things about the career Dwight Howard, unfortunately, were brought on by himself, but ultimately, had those things been remedied, I think certainly he would have and arguably should have made the 75th anniversary team in the league, but also we would be talking about potentially an all-time great level player. And to me, ultimately, that's the story of the career of Dwight Howard. Incredibly talented, incredibly strange career, but also has become pretty underappreciated when it comes to where he stands within the history of the league.